Welcome everybody to the weekly Torah class on this week's Torah portion, which is Parshat Vayishlac. And we're going to be discussing the source of why the Jewish nation observes bar and bat mitzvah at the age of 12 and 13, because its source is no less in this week's Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion, we have the well-known story of Shimon and Levi. See, what happens is that Dinah, their sister, is taking a stroll along the streets of the city of Shechem. That would be the area that the Arabs call Nablus today. And she is unfortunately and terribly, under terrible circumstances, abducted and raped by Shechem, who the city was named after, who is the prince of the city, the son of the ruler. Adding insult to injury, what happens? Shechem convinces himself that he's in love with Dinah and has asked her hand in marriage, and she seems to have very little say in it. And so he figures that he'll ask the family for permission to have her hand in marriage. They come along. Yaakov is unaware of what's going on. And Shechem and Shimon and Levi tell them, you know what? If you want to join the house of Israel, the house of Jacob, we can't have someone marry our sister who's not circumcised. So you know what? Not only should you circumcise, but it's not right for the whole extended mishpacha family, the whole city. So every adult should also be circumcised. As crazy as the idea is, Shechem is so infatuated with Dinah that him and his father convinces the city that it's to their benefit to have every male circumcised. Why? Because then, just as like I'm able to take Dinah's hand in marriage, we'll all be able to marry each other. It'll be good for commerce, for business, for economic development. Okay. So the whole male population circumcises themselves. And then what happens? On the third day, which we already know from Avram's story of being circumcised, seems to be the most difficult day and the most painful day and the most potentially serious day of hemorrhaging and so on and so forth. So when all the Torah tells us, when all the inhabitants were in pain, Shimon and Levi, Jacob's two sons, the brothers of Dinah, take up a sword and they come upon the city with confidence, and they slew every single man of the city. When word comes to Yaakov what Shimon and Levi did, he goes, oy vey, what you guys do? You know what's going to happen now? Yaakov was incensed. He realized that they're going to want to take revenge. I finally am coming to live the rest of my life in peace. And what you guys bring this sorrows, you brought this problem upon me. This is crazy. And Shimon and Levi, in response to their father, says, Papa, will our sister be made into a harlot? That's what you expected us just to let it go? Now, this is not our main topic of discussion, but I will take a pause to something that we've probably discussed before, that the commentaries do wonder, under what right did Shimon and Levi have to kill every single male member when really Shechem was the only culprit here? And maybe Yaakov was right. What did you do? Who gave you a right? And many of the commentaries take on different positions. One of them, by Maimonides no less, who states a law that when the 7 Noahide laws were given universally to all of humankind, one of the laws is that you have to establish a court of justice. Because while we have laws that you're not allowed to kill and you have to have a family life and so on and so forth, how do you ensure which all of these 7 Noahide laws are laws? to ensure the civility and the safety and the ability to sustain a society, a civilization. Well, if that's the case, then you have to have a system of courts and justices and police and so on and so forth to make that sure that the 7 universal laws are being upheld. And since no one took Shechem, and by the way, it's interesting because transgression of the universal laws is death, actually. So since they didn't upkeep one of the 7 Noahide laws, which is to establish a judicial system by which it would guarantee the observance of the other universal laws, apparently no one was judging Shechem, who certainly, even based upon universal laws, forget about Jewish law, what he did was unacceptable. So since they didn't do what they were supposed to do as a society, all of them are now guilty of death. That's one approach. Another approach is that Shimon and Levi knew without doubt that they were guilty of other things as well. They were guilty of idolatry and adultery and other abominations. They knew that maybe they were being a little vengeful, but all these guys were guilty of something that they were deserving of the death penalty. Anyways, and the list goes on. So there's an opinion that when they went, they actually only intended to kill Shechem, but then the rest of the city came out to protect their prince, and that's why they had to engage with everyone else. Anyways, but they took on the entire city. They risked the wrath and disapproval of their father, and they also risked that the entire revenge would not be taken off the table. And nonetheless, Shimon and Levi did it with confidence and self-assurance and so on and so forth. Now, this whole story is relevant to bar and bat mitzvah age because we have a tradition. And the tradition is that Shimon and Levi were, take a guess, how old were they? So we say that since Shimon and Levi were 13 years of age, big deal. No, there's something else to be said. Not only were they 13 years of age, but also they are referred to in the Torah. Vayikhu shnei v'nei aviv, Shimon v'Levi, ish charboy. The 2 children of Yaakov, Shimon and Levi, took a sword, but they uses the word ish, a man. So the Torah says that we know, and they figure it out based upon the years that Yaakov left Lavan and how long he traveled. And when Shimon and Levi were born, that at the time of this story, they were 13. And now, the fact that they were 13 and they're being referenced in the Torah as ish, a man, that's how we know that you become a man at 13. There's a whole reason why a woman becomes mature at 12. One of them is that Bina Yiseda Nitla Leisha, a greater level of intuition was given to a woman, and that maturity happens 1 year prior to a man. Also, we find that one could say that certainly Shimon and Levi displayed certainly adult-like behavior, and that in those days, the lifespan was already starting to shorten relative to what it was, and that life was very different. As you know, we baby our children, but in those days, by the time you were 13, you were already running the whole corral and the whole farm and the whole this. People matured earlier. Unfortunately, difficult times mature people quicker. And but nonetheless, while you can say anything you want, at the end of the day, the Torah tells us that this is how we know that the age of bar and bat mitzvah is 12 and 13. So it's a lesson for all eras. You can't start figuring out, oh, people were more mature then and so on and so forth. So the question becomes we have a couple of questions we can ask, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Why indeed is the number 13 a magic number? Just because you tell me Shimon and Levi did such an adult-like act and they were called, so that's a lesson for everybody else. But really, what's happening to a boy and girl at the age of 12 and 13? Because really, we know plenty of 12 and 13-year-olds and we can say that it's a far cry from mature adulthood. And also, it's kind of odd that the one story that the Torah is using to teach us the beautiful lesson of when a boy and a girl enters the age of bar mitzvah. What's bar mitzvah? That it's the age when you become obligated of mitzvah. And where do we learn it out from? A bloody, violent story. Yuck. That's what, by the way, Kinderlech, my dear child, you know how I know you're bar mitzvah today? From Shimon and Levi, when they wiped out the whole town of Shechem. Would that be a nice story to tell our children? Doesn't make any sense. And why doesn't any other nation even begin to believe that maturity could start at that age? So those are some of the questions that we're going to attempt to answer. And we're going to start off by saying that our sages were hinting to something. Our sages were telling us that under the surface, you may not realize this, but a profound growth is occurring at this age. What kind of profound growth is occurring at this age? And can we actually prove it? I mean, are you telling me that at this age, there's a maturity of understanding, there's a maturity of empathy? Like what's really happening at 12 and 13 years of age? So we have to change our point of context here. You see, when we think about adults, we're trying to envision someone who's calm and collected, capable of making measured choices, calculated decisions, focus, the ability of deliberation. But the Torah is telling us, if that's what you're thinking, a 13-year-old is certainly not that. But rather, when the Torah is speaking of maturity, it's speaking in the context of emotional maturity. What is emotional maturity? The ability to empathize. So adulthood, according to Torah, is not intellectual maturity, but rather emotional. Not in intellectual intelligence, but rather emotional intelligence. And what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to relate to things or to others outside of ourselves. You see, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote a booklet on prayer, and he wrote something very profound. He said, you see, a person can have a concrete understanding of something. You could really fully understand something, but yet you cannot experience it emotionally. A person could understand that smoking is not good for them. They can understand that this relationship would be toxic for them. But emotionally, they cannot connect. We find this a lot with children, that they lack the ability to know something and to develop an emotional intimacy to it. Like when you grab your brother's toy, which you know time and time again is going to get him to cry. So children could be very bright, children could be very smart, but they don't understand, not power, not wealth. They're not emotionally attached to it. Tell your child, no, this is too expensive. What does that mean? They know what it means. Sometimes they can't afford spending money on their own, but they don't have the same emotional relationships that we do. So children will typically worry about things that affect them. What doesn't affect their immediate world doesn't worry them at all. If this is true about people and things, it certainly is going to be true about God's mitzvahs. Because really, what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is the ability to perceive how precious and valuable what I'm about to do is to God. And if you can't empathize that, you're not going to feel any obligation. And that's why kids are carefree. They don't necessarily feel the gravity of their actions. And as long as they're not going to feel the gravity of their actions, you can't expect them to have an obligation to do mitzvahs. Now, as we grow and as we mature, we're not going to talk about what age just yet, but we assume as we grow and as we mature, we develop an ability to think abstractly. Not everything has to be concrete. We begin to learn about another person's love and another person's fear and another person's pleasure or another person's concern. We learn how to empathize. If something is hurtful to someone, as we mature, we won't do it. So when the Torah, our sages say, call Shimon and Levi at the age of 13, and are calling them grown men, it doesn't mean they were saying they were so intellectually bright. I don't know how bright it is to go and challenge an entire city, but what the Torah is telling us, that they displayed tremendous empathy. When they realize what Shechem did to their sister Dinah, when they realize and feel Dinah's pain, which is undeniable and unbearable, and they tell Yaakov, what Yaakov, what pops? Make our sister a harlot? They revealed the depth of their empathy. And so that's what the Torah is saying. You know what happens at 12 and 13? You begin to get emotionally connected. You can start to feel other people's pains. And when that happens, you become capable of understanding and appreciating the depth and the seriousness of fulfilling God's will through a mitzvah, or God forbid, transgressing God's will through a sin. And again, on the surface, we may not see much change in their behavior just yet, but the Torah believes that underneath, this empathy begins to blossom. So I'm not going to, when I tell you that this is the Torah's opinion, it's the Torah's opinion. Is it nice to read some psychologist who says the same thing? Yes. It's not what we need, but it's what people feel better about. And for us, it feels good because we always say that science is there when it's right science and truthful science. It will always become a medium by which we can see that the Torah's truthfulness is that everybody agrees to it. So leading psychologists do assert that children become capable, like I said, of abstract thought and empathy as they enter their teens, which is really about two qualities. It's the ability to think outside of yourself. The whole world's not about you. And the second thing is the ability to care about things also outside of oneself. So I'm just quickly going to quote two psychologists, not that I'm so knowledgeable in their writings, but one is from Jean Piaget, who mapped out 4 stages of a child's cognitive development. He writes that the final stage, which begins at 11, is called the formal operational stage. At this age, they become capable of deductive reasoning, drawing specific conclusions from abstract concepts using logic. At around the age of 12, they become capable of abstract thought and begin to consider possible outcomes and consequences of actions. That's just one. A second one is from a gentleman called Lawrence Kohlberg on moral development. And he found that until adolescence, children are primarily motivated by self-interest. As children enter adolescence, they become more concerned about maintaining relationships and take other people's perspectives and intentions into account when making decisions. So when we talk about things beginning to happen at 11 or 12, as we're giving that time to develop, it makes perfect sense that the Torah wasn't random when it said that at 12 or 13, we celebrate a child's religious maturity, because that's when they can begin to think about the ramifications and consequences of their actions. So there you have it. I'm not finished yet, don't worry. So now, because we haven't even answered the questions. One of our major questions was, why do we infer the beginning of religious worship to God at 12, 13 at Bar Bat Mitzvah from a story that's so bloody and violent? That was the question. Before we answer this question, I want to tell you that there's a totally other school of thought. What is that total other school of thought? It says, by the way, stop with this whole idea of empathy, emotional intelligence versus logical intelligence. Well, stop. Guess what? The idea that Bar Bat Mitzvah is 12 and 13, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel wrote that this is a law that God passes on to Moshe at Sinai. And Moshe passed it on to Joshua, and it's been passed on to the generations. And that's it. We call that Halacha Moshe Misinai. You know what the reasoning for that is? It's no reasoning. He writes that basically it's a mystery that transcends the grasp of the human mind. It was dictated by God to Moshe and doesn't have a rational basis. It's a mystery only to God. Now, what we're going to do today is something phenomenal. Because on the surface, I've just given you two totally different reasons. One is, you can think all you want. You're never going to figure it out. Some random age that we were given that only God knows why. And then I just brought you like, wow, there's it's empathy and it's this, and I brought you proofs from psychologists. There seems to be such a logical approach to this. So which one is it? So I'm going to suggest something that the Rebbe spoke about, that we can in some way reconcile these two opinions. That we will, in a sense, figure out that they're both addressing the Bar Bat Mitzvah kid, and they're actually not arguing. They're only telling you, by the way, there are two nuances of service to God that when we're introducing the Bar Bat Mitzvah to now their obligatory obedience to Hashem, each one of these opinions is emphasizing another area of that obedience. Neither of them are disagreeing that the other nuance of obedience is important. The only thing they're arguing about is which is more important, the foundation or the secondary. And let me explain. There are two ways to serve God, as you've probably heard from me many times. One is obedience and discipline. We call it Kabbalat Ol. Hey, I don't need to know the reason. I don't need to know the logic. Hashem wants me to do A, I do A. Hashem wants me to do B, I do B. There's another way that I love the reasoning and logic behind the mitzvah. I want to pursue that. It makes me passionate about the mitzvah then, if I could truly understand it. The question is, which of those two ways is primary? And the way that we answer influences how we see what's most important. What's the most important underlying emphasis is when we become bar mitzvah. No doubt both modalities are important. It's crucial to serve Hashem from a standpoint of reason and understanding. Like I said, it makes it more meaningful to us. On the other hand, obedience can't be diminished because it's also critical for when you don't understand something. Sometimes a person needs to be able to say, I will obey even if I don't understand, like the Jews did at Sinai, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do in here. Both of these abilities are given to a bar and bat mitzvah boy and girl. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, in his Code of Jewish Law, he says the primary and final state of the sacred soul's entry into the body is at the age of 13 for a boy and 12 for a girl. This is why they become obligated in the Torah's commandments at that age. You see, the ability to surrender to a higher power, even when your mind is filled with doubts and concerns. How do you have? If you tell me that at the age of 12, 13, I could begin to appreciate God wanting me to do A and not do B. And if I do it, though I'm really hurting God, well, yes, at 12 and 13, I'm beginning to empathize. I could start thinking about the consequences of my actions outside of myself. When it's hurtful to something else or to someone else, I got that. But this ability to be obedient to God, even when I don't understand something, where does that come from? So the Alter Rebbe writes, that's also possible at 12, 13, because that's when your neshama, that's when your soul is completely enmeshed and absorbed by your body. Because in order for you to transcend your mind and say, I will do something even though when it's not feeling quite logical at the moment, that can't come from your mind. Your mind would actually be, on the contrary, trying to negate it, reject it. It has to come from somewhere greater than your mind, and that's your soul. And the ability to be able to do that even at the age of 12, 13 is because your neshama is completely revealed to you at the age of 12, 13. So both things are happening at 12, 13. Your neshama comes, and like that opinion that says, you know why you're bar mitzvah at 12, 13? Because it's a mystery. God told us so, and that's it. And therefore, just keep the mitzvahs. And you know why you can do that? Even when your mind is clouded with doubt, because basically your neshama has just entered your body fully. And by the way, I want you now to do mitzvahs where you start to appreciate the importance of the mitzvah. How are you capable of doing that? Because at this age, Hashem wired the human being that you can begin to empathize and feel the consequences of your actions, not only when they concern you. Two things are happening at the same time. At this point, we can understand that at this age, we can appreciate the profundity of the Torah. And at the same time, we have the ability to surrender to God even when we don't understand. So what are the two opinions? Now we could say that we can reconcile the two opinions, that they're not really arguing. One opinion is emphasizing the importance of what we build atop the foundation of Kabbalat all of obedience, which is learn and try to understand and try to appreciate. And the other opinion is emphasizing the foundation itself. So one opinion will say 12 and 13 was chosen because it's when our maturity begins. Discipline is truly the foundation of Jewish commitment, but the most valuable aspect of Judaism is when we understand, because then we can be passionate about it. And the other opinion says, no, it's great that you understand, but the most important aspect of Jewish obedience is the foundation of one's fierce loyalty and unquestioning obedience to Hashem. Now that we know this, now we can appreciate why the story that proves that a man is at 12, 13 comes from this bloody, violent story, because On the surface, you say, whoa, what is this all about? But when we analyze it a little bit deeper, how were Shimon and Levi able to overlook all the risk and the wrath of their father only if they had a deep loyalty to their sister, a deep conviction to their sister, which is what the second opinion is all about. That's what bar bat mitzvah are like. They were so consumed by the distress over the violation of their sister, they had only one choice, that each man took up the sword. And in the words of the Rebbe, he says, this is precisely why we derive the age of bar bat mitzvah from this passage. It's a message to every bar bat mitzvah person that even when we have doubts and we want to stray from our hearts and we want to become our own harlot, looking at things outside of what Hashem wants, and just like a harlot drives a wedge between husband and wife, so does sin form a barrier between us and God. And when we're confronted with such temptations, and we can rashly wrap our heads around it, our only response can be a stubborn resistance, even to the point of self-sacrifice. And even at the age of bar bat mitzvah, there must be a stubborn determination that transcends all reason. And where do we have an amazing story? And although it's a little bloody and gory, it's the story of Shimon and Levi. They're telling a bar bat mitzvah girl that sometimes you have to overcome everything and do what's necessary. When we see the empathy, which is the first reason why we have bar bat mitzvah at that age, because they had empathy for Dinah. They were unwilling to look the other way. Their unquestioning commitment overlooked every consideration that could have legitimately excused them from doing what they did. It tells us both things. It tells the bar bat mitzvah boy and girl that the reason this age was chosen because your empathy begins to develop. But it also tells you to assume that the foundation of Yiddishkeit is your loyalty that should transcend even logical reasons or explanation. And this is really an amazing story, because when you think about it, how else would you explain such a crazy story to teach us the most important entry of a Jewish boy and girl into the age of mitzvah? Now, why don't other nations have it? So nations form their natural identity. What's their natural identity? A common land, the need to protect it, constitutional laws, and so on and so forth. When can you protect the land? You go to the army when you're 20, the whole maturity is different. But for Jewish people, as soon as we left Egypt into the desert, we didn't need a land to have our constitution of Torah. That foundation, that constitution, became the portal of our nationhood. In fact, we were a nation far longer without our land than we were a nation with our land. And that's why our entry into adulthood doesn't have to do with a country and protection and army and so on and so forth. But it begins when we're mature enough to protect our constitution, which is Torah and mitzvahs, by understanding what a great privilege and responsibility it is for all of us. And that is your lesson for today.